Like many countries in the world, Japan has quite a few notable tortoise and turtles in its iconography and folklore. Be it the black tortoise Genbu, who was imported from the Chinese constellations and protects the north side of the city of Kyoto, or the turtle that is saved by Urashima Taro and promptly carries him down to the palace of the Dragon King at the bottom of the sea. These animals may not be as emblematic as the koi carp or the red-crowned crane, but they most certainly have their place. One is even the symbol or an aspect of the god of merchant sailors, Kompira. These animals, humble as they may be, are ones that people, ranging from the lowest-born peasant to the mightiest lord, would see sunbathing on rocks and swimming in water bodies all the time. But perhaps the most influential impact of the tortoise is in Japan's yokai, and one of the most famous of these, both natively and abroad, is the Kappa. If you have absorbed just about any amount of Japanese media, then you've likely seen some variant of the Kappa, likely as some manner of cutesy mascot holding a cucumber, which is certainly very different from how they've been depicted and described throughout their history. With Monster Hunter Rise's designs taking so many cues from Japanese folklore and yokai, it's frankly unsurprising that the Kappa would be represented in the game, and it comes in the form of the latest in the line of big bulky boys with inflatable stomachs, Tetranadon. But how? In what ways? Well, below the immediate surface there's quite a few references and nods to the Kappa and other turtles from Japanese folklore in Monster Hunter Rise, along with plenty of things from Sumo as well. So, with that in mind, let's take a look and find where legend became reality with Monster Hunter Rise and the Tetranadon. The Kappa has a somewhat variable depiction, but several key features are usually kept between versions. They are humanoids, about the size of a child but stronger than a man, with a turtle-like beak and shell, skin that is either green or red and brown, and with webbed hands and feet. Sluggish on land, they are exceedingly capable in water, not unlike the turtles they share features with. Like many yokai, they have a frankly bizarre number of traits and aspects, many of which I will not be going into in this video. In papers, more than 80 different names have been found for Kappa, and many of these have their own variants and deviations from the basic legend. So for the purpose of the video, we're going to be looking at a close to a base form of the Kappa as possible, and at things that shall link back later when we examine the similarities to Tetranadon. Kappa have one great weakness, and that is the dish on their foreheads. These need to be kept filled with water at all times, and if not, the Kappa becomes far weaker and easier to overcome. Thus, if a person encountering one bows in their direction, the Kappa will feel obliged to return the bow and thus tip the water from the dish. This can be extremely detrimental. It might leave the Kappa paralyzed in place to slowly starve or dehydrate in the sun. Kappa are viewed in quite a few ways. In plenty of stories they are mischievous, peeking up women's kimono or releasing great bursts of flatulence to shock and horrify those around them. In other stories they are honourable and helpful, irrigating farmers' land in return for their favourite food, the cucumber. Indeed, in some stories a Kappa that has its empty head dish refilled with water will serve a person loyally afterwards, and befriending a Kappa might save one from drowning someday. There are even stories that Kappa are knowledgeable about bone setting and that they taught this field of medicine to humans. But just as often, and perhaps more prevalently, in some stories Kappa are actively malevolent, luring or kidnapping people into water and then using their great strength and proficiency in wrestling to drown them, drink their blood, or eat their flesh. Furthermore, Kappa are often said to victimize animals in particular. Cows and horses seem to be a favourite. Indeed, one of their names is Komahiki, which means horse puller. One rather odd piece of Kappa lore that shall become relevant later is its interest in a strange occult part of a human body called the Shirikadama. Whether as an organ or some esoteric substance, the Shirikadama is often said to contain a person's soul, and is found inside the body just below the navel. Kappa crave people's Shirikadama, and have a preferred route to it through the anus, either by taking hold of it with the hand, or using their beak and removing it a bit more viscerally. Quite what the Kappa does with the Shirikadama once it has extracted it is another question entirely, and one without satisfying answers, but doing so inevitably results in the death of the human being it was taken from, that much is for sure. If anyone has played the game Sekiro or Nioh, then you may recognise this means of attack, and if you did not understand why the Headless and Kappa in those games decided to attack you the way they did, well, consider yourself enlightened to this horrific form of death. Kappa are often portrayed to love sumo, the national sport of Japan. Indeed, one other way to force them to spill the water from their head dish is to outdo them in a sumo match, although actually doing so is difficult considering their great strength. Somewhat maligned by the fat men in diapers perception, sumo is a sport with a really ancient history. The first recorded mention is from 712 in the Kojiki, the oldest of Japan's texts, which contains a great deal of its creation story. Before that, there are accounts written long after the fact of sumo contests put on by emperors and empresses to impress foreign visitors. It is a sport of the gods with a divine origin as well, when, supposedly, 4,000 years ago, the gods Takamikazuchi and Takaminikata grappled for control over the Japanese archipelago. The former won and went on to establish the Japanese imperial family. There's a huge amount of Shinto ritual and technique in sumo that will be going into quite a bit of detail later, but the most important rule is that the first wrestler, known as a rikishi, to be forced from the ring or let any part of their body touch the floor that isn't the soles of their feet is the loser. Personally, we need more sumo-themed enemies, bosses and characters in video games. There's a wealth of great stuff and interesting techniques that could be applied to them. One of my favourite bosses ever was a sumo wrestler from the game Mad World, so I guess I am a little biased. Tetranadon's name and nickname is quite an odd one to look into. In its intro ecology it is referred to as an amphibious wrestler, which frankly does not give too much to go on bar referencing the Kappa's famed love of sumo. In Japanese we get a bit more. Translated the name becomes Kappa Frog, a direct reference in the same vein as that for Bishaten's Tengu Beast. And, even more interestingly, the full Japanese name is Yotsumi Wado. The Yotsumi part is actually the name of a particular grip in sumo, which we're going to be looking into a bit later when it comes to Tetranadon's moveset, but for now bear it in mind, it's a nice reference to a Kappa's favourite sport. The Wado part as well is the Chinese pronunciation for the characters that make up Kappa's name. In terms of design, the director for Monster Hunter Rise mentioned in an interview that Tetranadon's other aspects were inspired by other real-world creatures. In this chimeric mishmash, the most obvious and blatant aspect of Tetranadon that calls upon the Kappa is of course the turtle-like shell, which is not unlike that of a Japanese pond turtle, a species endemic to Japan. The moss that covers Tetranadon and serves to camouflage it is another reference, although in this case it's one that's quite possibly multifaceted. Kappa are typically depicted with green skin and scales, yes, but actively looking at real-world turtles, this is frankly fairly uncommon, as most often as a result of the growth of algae on their bodies that helps to camouflage them from potential predators and prey. But alongside being to avoid notice while submerged, I think that the vast growths of this feathery algae on the body of Tetranadon may actually be a reference to another turtle from Japanese mythology, the Minogami, which is of such a venerable age that behind its long seaweed trails, Tetranadon has a rather long tail compared to the average turtle, and the long fronds of algae that grow from it make it seem quite a bit longer than even that when viewed from above, to create this impression of long, trailing plant matter that reaches behind it. The distinctive dish atop a Kappa's head, mentioned earlier, is also present on Tetranadon. In-game it is noted to protect the monster's vulnerable head and to grow more brilliantly blue with time. Although frankly, given its size in comparison to the rest of the skull, I rather struggle to comprehend how it could realistically protect the monster. But what is more important is that it's there as a reference, and compromising the dish also renders Tetranadon more at risk, mirroring how the draining of the Kappa's dish also serves to depower them. It's worth taking a look at Tetranadon's various behaviours and attacks in quite a bit of detail. Before we touch on the meat of this section with Tetranadon's attacks, I have to mention that the intro for Tetranadon really carries across the more malevolent Kappa-like aspect as a fearsome, lurking aquatic monster that one would not even know is there without warning signs for a keen eye. In the blink of an eye, it ambushes and attacks its prey, not unlike how a crocodile bursts from the water to drag a person performing some errand or swimming down to the depths. There's certainly stories of Kappa luring people into water, and this may be referenced in the monster's intro mentioning Tetranadon beckoning silently, although frankly that may be hyperbole or to add a sense of mystique to the monster, because it certainly doesn't seem to beckon, more charge. At the same time, the Kappa's favourite food has been referenced in a bit of additional material for the game. Tetranadon's favourite prey, according to concept artist, is a small green cucumber-shaped creature called a gookumber, which, to be honest, does not sound particularly appealing at all. The design team took the Kappa's love of sumo and made a lot of it in the form of Tetranadon's moveset. Whilst perhaps not the most realistic way a monster would attack and overwhelm its attackers and prey, it certainly adds an interesting slant to Tetranadon that I think is lost with other monsters. In the monster's intro, it is mentioned to not let yourself be pushed out of the ring, which of course references the main rule of sumo mentioned earlier. In terms of Tetranadon's actual behaviour, let's start with perhaps the most recognisable of techniques in sumo, the great vertical foot stomps that our big boy performs in his intro cinematic, and even as a somewhat devastating attack. Most people who know of sumo even indirectly will have seen the wrestlers performing these big dramatic stomps, which are called shiko, and perhaps wondered about their purpose. As part of daily training, a rikishi may perform hundreds of these a day as a means to strengthen the leg muscles and bones. Try doing it a few times, it's quite an experience. It left my legs rather numb. Shiko are also performed before a match, with both wrestlers mixing them and casting salt onto and around the ring as a means to purify it of evil and demons, an aspect that comes from the sport's origins and tradition as Shinto ceremony to entertain the gods. In many of its turf wars, Tetranadon relies on its sheer bulk to resist the charges of the monsters it is up against, except of course in its frankly abominable one with Anjanath, in which it lets its neck get grabbed without any efforts to retract it into its shell, the main defensive feature it possesses. In sumo as well, the reason why rikishi tend to be so large is to resist the sheer force of the initial contact and impact called the tachiai. In older times, sumo wrestlers tended to be smaller and less bulky, but over time the need and requirement for more mass came to be. Indeed, in its good turf wars, Tetranadon bulks itself up intentionally by swallowing water, which helps in that initial impact, successfully repelling Volvidon, Lagombi and Azoros. They even go toe-to-toe weight-wise with the impressively strong Gos Harag, well until everyone's favourite Namahage decides to cheat and go ham on it. But with regards to the earlier mention of Tachiai, in these turf wars Tetranadon and its competitor tend to follow another rule of sumo. See, for all the posturing that may take place in the 4 minutes before a match, it doesn't actually begin until the moment both wrestlers take their place and both fists are set upon the ground of the ring. From then on, the match begins, and in each turf war bar with Anjanath, perhaps by virtue of most of them being against quadrupedal monsters, both sides do the same. This is most pronounced with Gos Harag's turf war. Both monsters bring their front limbs to the ground before contact is made, despite being more than capable of bipedal movement, and in fact it might even be advantageous to do so. So earlier we mentioned Yotsumi being part of Tetranadon's full Japanese name, and that it is a grip in sumo. Specifically, it is when both wrestlers grip one another under the arms, typically by the belt, and is used in most cases for sideways throws or in preparation for some other technique. Tetranadon's name not only references this, but in fact it actually makes use of it during its turf wars with Azoros, Volvidon and Lagombi, to not only grip the other monster, but then to throw them away. I'm pretty certain that this sort of throw is one specifically known as Uwatanage, but sumo has an incredible variety of technique names in which even a slight variation can have a completely different title. So if any eagle-eyed sumo experts happen to watch this, please feel free to correct me on this. Another major technique in sumo that Tetranadon makes use of is open palm thrusts. In sumo, the proper name for this is supapari, and acts as the wrestler's main option to create space or push an opponent away and hopefully out of the ring to win the match. In other games that feature sumo, if they are not a grappler of some variety, then they'll likely have some manner of palm thrusting technique. Again, like with Uwatanage previously, there's a huge variety of names for different forms of palm thrusting techniques. I believe that the variety Tetranadon is making use of is Tsukidashi, in which the wrestler advances and uses supapari to force their opponent backwards and out of the ring. Finally, the last of Tetranadon's attacks that references sumo is this move, in which it draws its arm back and claps them with such force it creates a shockwave. In real life, this is a rarely used technique called nekodamashi, and is used during the tachiai to try and force the other rikishi to blink or be distracted long enough that the other can take advantage of it. It's not seen too often, it's quite a high risk, high reward technique, and if it fails, the side that does so is at quite a disadvantage. Done looking at Tetranadon's behaviour and attacks, it's frankly unfortunate there's very little to say when it comes to equipment. Whilst I like the aesthetic of the swampy green armour that would blend in so well with the environment, it's of very little use for me when it comes to talking about references to the Kappa. What does make for a good reference, though, is one of Tetranadon's parts. That is the shiny nacre. Nacre as a substance is typically formed by pearls and muscles and is the substance that the latter are made from, surrounding irritations and parasites to prevent them from negatively affecting the organism. It's odd that this sort of material would be created by Tetranadon. Even odder is the description for this part, which reads, "orb formed within the body of a Tetranadon, possibly made of souls," which is certainly a rather grim description for a rare carve, if you ask me. But if you remember back to the rather unpleasant description earlier of the Shurikadama, then perhaps it begins to make more sense. While certainly the Tetranadon never removes this small ball of soul from the hunter's navel in the same way that Kappa do in Legends, it's a nice reference. It rather makes me wonder what sort of local legends about the Tetranadon must have contributed towards such a suspicion and the ability of the hunter and local people to appraise this part and immediately come to such a conclusion. Perhaps that's a question for any future content to avoid, to be honest. Well, that's Tetranadon and its links to the Kappa. Hope you have found this examination interesting. Much like when I covered Bishaten, I had to go into a tangent on a completely different topic, in this case sumo. But if nothing else, I hope you have enjoyed learning all about not only yokai, but an interesting and ancient sport. Tetranadon certainly has a charm to me, not unlike how Dodegama did in World. There's something about these big podgy monsters that just makes me smile when I see them. When I first started writing the script for this monster, I was worried there would be not too much to discuss, but like with many of Rise's monsters, the moment you scratch under the surface it turns out there's a wealth of detail to examine. Please let me know if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe if you have interest in seeing future ones about the yokai origins of various Monster Hunter monsters. But until then, happy hunting everyone.